Hello to everyone who's at the Alleluia conference. My name is Jake Mulder, and I am leading this session on changing worship styles without a fight. If I have not been able to connect with you in a previous session, I am the Senior Director of Strategy at the Fuller Youth Institute, and I'm the Executive Director of Leadership Formation for Fuller Theological Seminary. And it is really great to be with you today for this, which is not an easy topic to engage with. Now, I want to say in full disclosure, I am not a worship leader. I struggle with singing and clapping my hands on rhythm at the same time. So full disclosure, I probably do not have the same day job as what many of you have. But I get to study thousands of churches across the United States. I get to interact with a number of worship leaders, churches of many different types. And from the worship leaders I know and churches that I get to study, I am going to guess that you get to deal with a decent amount of conflict in your role. I would imagine, and again, I don't know you necessarily, but from the different churches that I know and different people I know who lead worship, shape liturgy, that sort of thing, I'm going to guess that you interact with some people who want everything related to worship in the church to change now. My guess is you interact with other people who never want anything in worship to change. And then you've got kind of everywhere in between. And often decisions about worship and worship style and worship space can result in fights and can result in conflict. Now, let me share with you a quick story about one church that I have interacted with in the past. This one happens to be a Presbyterian church. It is a historic congregation. They are located right across the street downtown. This is actually a Texas congregation, I'll say that. They are located right across the street from their city hall in their community. You know that they're a historic building because they've actually got the historic marker. I know because I took these photos myself. And so here's the church building. And as I was working with this church, it was one of the elders of the church told me this story because we were focused on some changes that we wanted to make. And this elder said, "Oh no, this is going to be just like the ceiling tiles." And I thought, "Oh no, the ceiling tiles, what does that mean?" And he told me that in the church's worship space, in the area that the church holds its worship, there was a time when the church had some ceiling tiles. Okay, the ceiling tiles, these aren't an exact picture. This happened a couple of decades ago, but they were those white acoustic ceiling tiles that looked something like this. My guess is that you have seen what I'm talking about before. But the problem was, this elder told me, that the ceiling tiles weren't in good condition. They had been in the area for maybe 30, 40 years. They had been there as long as anyone could remember on the ceiling of the church in the worship area. And the problem was that there had been water damage over time. And they started to look something like this, right? Maybe you've seen this before, where water damage begins to come in and these white ceiling tiles were beginning to fall apart. Parts of them had released slightly and had broken. I don't think one had actually fallen on someone in the past, but very close to. So this elder went on to share with me that it was just a no-brainer decision. They took a congregational vote and everyone agreed that the ceiling tiles should come down, right? No, if you're paying attention, you would know that's not how it went, because simple things like that do not happen in churches. This elder shared that when they made the decision, the property committee made the decision that the ceiling tiles needed to come down, there was a protest from many folks in the congregation about those ceiling tiles being removed. And the problem is that many people had an emotional attachment to the way that the building looked with those ceiling tiles. Those ceiling tiles had been there as long as anyone remembered. And they thought, well, for generations, at least this was the case that they made, when we worship in our church and we look up towards God, we see these ceiling tiles. It's what we know. Well, they finally got the permission needed from the leadership got the permission needed from the building committee to take the ceiling tiles out, and with much resistance, they went in to remove the ceiling tiles. And I want to show you the photo of what happened when they removed those ceiling tiles. It went from this image that you're seeing, or something very much like it. This is the ceiling in that church as it stands today. I took this photo myself, and you'll notice that there's this wood. I was going to say paneling, but it's not paneling. There's this original wood ceiling in the church. I will go to this next slide here. This is the ceiling in the church building that had been covered up by those ugly white stained ceiling tiles. Now, the point that I want to make here is not just telling a story about ceiling tiles. And my guess is that each of you could insert your own story, whether it's about the carpet color, or it's about a song that you changed, or a flag where you moved the location. Often when we make changes, those changes come with resistance, and those changes can come with a fight. And in the case of this church, people weren't actually attached to the original better thing. People were attached to the tacky, old, harmful, outdated thing that was there, and they had no idea, no imagination for what might be behind those ceiling tiles. Now, I haven't even gotten into specific changes to what happens within worship. I'm just talking about a little bit of the architecture, but my sense is that you're able to resonate with some aspect of that story. Well, what I want to do in this session, my specialty as part of the Fuller Youth Institute at Fuller Seminary is focusing on young people and engaging young people in the life of the overall church. So I want to think about, as we consider integrating young people into our worship, as we consider integrating young people into the overall life and witness of our church, that often carries with it the assumption that we're going to make some sort of change to our worship style. Now, you might have different labels for this, but that might go with, well, we've got kind of the dreaded battle between a traditional service and a contemporary service. And I don't know, whatever's on the other side of contemporary. And that can often bring with it conflict, can often bring with it a fight. What I want to do here is offer you some categories to think through, specifically as you are incorporating young people into worship in whatever form that might take, or even if you're not incorporating them in worship, but you're just trying to think about how to have a worship experience that is reflecting all generations. What are some of the categories? What are some of the principles that you might think about as you make those changes? Now, my primary focus, as I said, is as a researcher and someone who creates resources for the Fuller Youth Institute. I am also wrapping up my PhD with a focus on congregational leadership and congregational change at Fuller Seminary. So these are things that I get to think about, research, advise on, and enact in my own congregation and congregations that I get to work with on a regular basis. So I'm going to share some slides and go ahead and take you in to some of these principles that might relate to changing worship styles without a fight. Now, the first one that I want to offer you comes from an expert, Ron Heifetz. Ron Heifetz is at Harvard. Ron Heifetz is an expert in leadership and change. And what he says is that people don't resist change, they resist loss. People don't resist change, they resist loss. When I first began to understand this principle, much of the resistance that comes when changes are made started to make a lot more sense to me. And the idea of that is that we often think and we often lament the fact that people resist changes and we get frustrated and we say, why don't people want to change? Why aren't they open to the changes that I'm trying to make? And I would dare say that most people do not, in fact, resist change, but they resist the loss that is associated with that change. Now, I believe that because I've seen it to be true, but also because of experts like Ron Heifetz who write about it. And I think it will bring you as a leader much more empathy, much more sympathy, maybe much more patience as you're trying to make changes. If you connect with this principle that people don't necessarily resist change, they resist loss. Now, if you are not convinced, I want you to imagine that tax time rolls around next year and the IRS writes you a letter and they say, hey, in previous years, we have actually undercharged you. You have not paid enough in taxes for a few decades. So we now need to charge you a higher tax rate. And in fact, you have back taxes that you owe. So we need you to pay that amount and you have to write us a check for $200,000. Now, my question is, would you resist that change? My guess, unless you're lying, is that you said yes, you would resist that change. I want to flip the situation around and imagine that the IRS, same situation, but they have overcharged you. And they say, hey, we've overcharged you. We apologize. We're going to write you a check with interest, and we are going to pay you $200,000. Would you resist that change? Now, again, my guess, unless you're lying, is no, you would not resist that change. Why? Both of those are a change experience. In one of those, you're experiencing a loss, and in the other, you are not experiencing a loss. As it goes with taxes, so it goes with other areas of our life. And I've seen this true in the church time and time and time again. Many of us are used to change in our lives. We're actually pretty tolerant of change. Many of us are okay with change. What we resist is when there is a pain, when there's a hurt, when there's a loss feeling that goes with that change. Now, when you make changes in worship, many people, because of the way they're wired, because they are used to it, because they love the way that things have been, may resist those changes as a loss. And one of the questions for you to ask is, with this change that we're making, what is the loss that some people might experience? If you will explore that question the next time you're thinking about making a change in worship, I think you will get a long ways down the road. Okay, well, let's say we are going to make a change. We are going to ask people to encounter or to feel some sense of loss. How do we respond to that? Now, the first tip that I would give you comes from Scott Cormode. Scott Cormode is a professor at Fuller Seminary. He says this: leadership begins with listening. Leadership begins with listening. Now, he doesn't say leadership is only about listening, or once you've listened, you're done. But he does say that leadership, it doesn't start with telling other people what to do. And many of us, if we've become the leader of something, we think, well, great, now I get to tell others what to do. Scott would say, no. That is not the first job of a leader. The first job of a leader is to listen. The implication here is, if you are in a position where you are thinking about making changes, I would encourage you to consider how might you listen to those who are going to be affected by that change, to understand where it is that they're coming from and how they're going to experience that loss. Listening can bring a good deal of clarity. I once worked with a church, and I know that I am positioned here as the one focused on young people. You might be expecting me to say, you should just make all the changes in your worship to make it more conducive and positive for young people. There's some version of that that I would encourage, but not exclusively. There was one church that I was brought in to work with, and they originally thought that their church all wanted to maintain a focus on older generations, and that's actually part of the reason that they brought me in. Is they said, hey, we need an outside consultant because our church does not want to change. Everyone in the church wants to keep focusing on an older generation. Can you help us figure out how to make that change? And I thought, well, let's begin with some listening and just make sure that we're coming at this from the right perspective. So I helped them put together a survey, and in the survey, we asked, what should they focus on? What should they be doing when it comes to worship, but other areas of the life of the church? And lo and behold, what that survey said is many people, including the older generation, said, if we keep focusing the way that we are going to die. We need to begin thinking about how we are going to focus on young people well. Now, they didn't want to make rash decisions. They didn't want to do it immediately or overnight, but they all wanted to move that direction. The team I was working with said, well, something must be off about that survey. I wonder if that fits kind of what we've done before. So they dug out a survey that had been conducted in the church about 8 or 10 years ago and about 15 or 20 years ago. And in that survey, both surveys, the primary response from what the church should be focusing on was ministry with younger generations. So sometimes we spend the time listening, but we forget about the listening that we've done. But the first implication, if we're going to navigate change well, is to make sure that we are listening well. The practical application that I would consider for you is just to think through, are there ways that you can maintain a connection with people in your church, particularly those who you're going to be asking to make some sort of change? I do wonder if you could establish some sort of sounding board or group or panel. We've seen some churches do this by making it kind of a multi-generational group where they've got some teenagers or young adults. They've got some people in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and older, that whenever they're going to make a significant change, it's just a group of people that they run things by to get advice. I've already talked about the idea of conducting surveys of people in the church, or I've seen others who have a worship team or a worship committee, and they just make it a practice that once a month or once a quarter, they're going to have a conversation with someone about the worship life of the church to get feedback on how it comes across, on if it's hitting the mark, those sorts of things. So how might you incorporate listening in your decision making, particularly before you make major changes? The second one is this. We have found time and time and time again that people support what they help to create. People support what they help to create. And I think sometimes what either happens in practice or at least in terms of impression is that people think that those who plan and run worship, those who shape the preaching, those who select the songs, those who shape the prayers, those who shape the public worshiping life of the church as corporately gathered, is kind of a very small and exclusive group, and no one else really has the opportunity to speak into that. Now, sometimes that is the case, but other times that's just the impression, and it's not really the way that things function. We have found many churches in the past who consider how to put together kind of an advisory team or a larger team than just those who are doing the work, and invite that team to help shape what worship, or specifically what the changes desired, might look like. This goes back to listening. We found that many churches, if they will actually take time before a change to get people's input on it, that could come from a survey, that could come from a congregational meeting, those sorts of things. If they will take time to let people help create what the change is going to look like, they often have a better chance of that change succeeding. The third principle that I would talk about here is the importance of vision. Okay. And my guess is if you've been to any church leadership gathering, conference, or book, been to a book, read the book, you would believe that vision is important. But I think that oftentimes vision is boiled down to kind of a statement that's written on the wall. It's something short, snappy, memorable. I'm not opposed to that sort of vision or a vision statement, but I am actually going for a picture or a story that people can carry around with them. I'm going to quote Scott Cormode again, who he describes vision as a shared story of future hope. Now, there's three pieces that are important about that. The first is shared. If a vision is shared, it means it's not just one person's idea and it does not benefit just one person or one group. Oftentimes, now I'm the author of a book called Growing Young. I work for the Fuller Youth Institute. I spend a lot of time focused on young people. I will say that oftentimes changes in worship that are brought about that involve young people, it is not a shared story. It's often a one-sided story. And the side is young people will benefit, everyone else will lose out. So for a vision, especially a difference in vision related to worship, the question is this a shared vision? Does everyone have a part in this? I'll talk more about that in a second. The second piece of this phrase is that it's a story. Statements often don't stick, stories do. Stories are memorable, stories hang with us, stories shape our lives. The more and more that you can invite people into a story in the future, we think the more likely it is to stick. Again, I'll give an example about that in a minute. But the third key is that this is a vision of future hope. As Christians, we are resurrection people. We are people of the gospel, of a God who does new things. And that our vision, it should be a story about future hope. Now, if we ask people to change, but we don't give them this vision, we're not giving them very much to go on in that change. And often they are just going to default back to what they've always known. The question that I would ask you is if you are inviting people to make some sort of change, if you're looking to make a change in worship, whether it's worship style, the type of music that you pursue, whether it's something in the aesthetic or the physical space, whatever change that you are looking to make, have you actually given them the vision, the shared story of future hope that they can believe in, that they can cling to, that they can get excited about, not just as a phrase or a statement, but as a story or a vivid picture that they can imagine, that they can live into? My other question, have you actually communicated it to the church? Oftentimes we found that a person or a team has the vision and they get it, but they haven't communicated it well to the rest of the church. Now, I said that I'd give you a couple of examples of this. One church that we've worked with is an Adventist church, and this Adventist church wanted to make some changes. So they went to their church for them on a Saturday, given they go to church on Saturday. And at their worship services on Saturday, they basically said, hey, we are going to make these changes to get more young people to come to our church. We are a church that's going to prioritize young people. How do you think that went for them? Not very well, because it wasn't a shared story of future hope. It was something that was going to benefit one group, and therefore it led to a lot of resistance. This team went back to trying to get people's input. They went back to listening, letting others shape the decision. And here's what they did. They spent a significant amount of time listening to the older generation in the church. And when they did that, here's what they heard. Several senior adults in the church said, hey, you're saying that we're just going to focus on young people and try and get more of them to come to our church. That doesn't feel like who we are. That doesn't feel like our identity. So the team said, well, who are we? What's our identity? In this church, and the name of their church was the name of their city, and then University Church. So they were called, something University Church. And these people said, well, you want to know who we are? We're the church about 60, 70 years ago where there was no church in our community for university students. There was specifically no Seventh-day Adventist church in our community for university students. And there was a church several miles away, but the students couldn't get there. So that church planted this church on the university campus to be a congregation that would serve the younger people when there was no church that was reaching and serving them. So the team said, 1 second, let me get this straight. You're saying the core of our identity is going and taking risks to reach a younger generation that no one will reach. And the senior adults that they talked to said, well, yeah, of course, that's our story. Don't you know how we were founded? From then on, the senior pastor and the worship team went to the church and said, we are a church who's getting back to our identity. We're going to do what we've always done and be who we've always been as a church. And that is a church who takes risks to engage, to reach young people who have no church in their area or in their life who will do that. They continued with making many of the very same changes that they were planning to make, but with a completely different vision, a completely different framing, one that was not about leaving their identity, but maintaining their identity and their history. And that framing made all the difference. That was a shared story of future hope that all people could find their way to live into. One other team we worked with spent time talking to people throughout the church. And this was a church where change was actually coming pretty easily. And they wondered why, specifically for an older generation, why were they so supportive of changes that seemed to benefit younger people? And the senior adults said, oh, it's very simple. We at our Bible study had a discussion and we decided that we want to be the church that our grandchildren want to worship in. I love that response. We want to be the church that our grandchildren want to worship in. And they had said there are some things that we're going to lose, and there's some things that we don't necessarily want to lose. But you know what? We want more than those things we're going to lose. It's to have our grandchildren worshiping with us. That is a vision. That is a powerful, vivid description for the future that people can latch onto. And I would encourage you to think through, if you're going to make a change, what's the vision that you're actually inviting people into, and have you communicated it to them in a way that connects? Okay, my fourth point here as we think about changes is to experiment on the margins, Some of us, we approach change by thinking about, we're going to start at the core and then work our way out. We'll start with the biggest, most important thing first and then work our way out. That is a very hard way to bring about change. I would say for many of you, that is actually your reality. If you shape worship, the corporate worship of your church and songs and preaching or teaching, you often have to try things and make your experiments on a very big stage. That is your reality. As you're thinking about changes, what I want to invite you to consider is, are there ways that you might look for smaller ways to try and explore, to try and experiment, to be able to try something and have it not go well, and that to be okay? I will give you a quick example. There's one church we worked with where they thought everyone wanted like a young adult hip service. And this is where I said, I don't want to get pigeonholed as the person who is only focused on prioritizing young people in worship. So this was a church, okay? Bear with me. This was a church that they really thought were ready to start a young adult worship service. It's going to be super hip. It's going to be super cool. This was primarily driven by a staff member or two, and then one or two kind of key worship volunteers who thought that's where we need to go. They spent some time talking to some people throughout the congregation and decided, here's what we're going to do. We're going to test something smaller first. They were truly talking about rolling this out on a Sunday morning and replacing one of their traditional services with this kind of young adult hip worship service. So they thought, okay, we'll conduct an experiment. Instead of starting it as our main thing on Sunday morning, we'll try it once a month. We'll try it on a weekend. We'll try it a weeknight here, a few different places. When they experimented with it, No one showed up for the hip young person's service. The young people kept showing up to the services that they were going through. So they tried it in a couple different places and still no one came. And they learned a valuable lesson without it costing them too much, which was there was not the need in their church for that young hip service. Now, there may be in yours. So I'm not saying that as a blanket statement for everyone, but just look for places that you can try things, that you can fail, that you can learn, that are safe, that you can experiment on the margins. Here's the last main point that I want to make. As you're thinking about changes, specifically changes in worship, those that focus on young people, to think about change as a process, not just an event. Now, you may be good at your job because you are good at events. You're good at putting on events, running events, executing events. I would encourage you to think about change as a process, not just an event. Now, here's an image to hold with you as a way to think about this. Many of us approach change like a microwave rather than a crock pot or a slow cooker. And what I mean by that is with a microwave, it heats things up very quickly. You've got a cold piece of pizza, pop it in the microwave, and it will be warmed up. You want to pop some popcorn, put it in the microwave, hit 2 minutes, and your popcorn will likely be popped. That is not the way that a crock pot or a slow cooker works. The slow cooker, I mean, it's called the slow cooker. It works by applying a low amount of heat over a long period of time. And if you're someone who enjoys cooking, you know much better than I do that using the slow cooker, it brings out flavors. It helps things marinate. It helps things cook in an entirely different way than what the microwave can do. Some of you might be used to the microwave approach to change in your church, and you need to consider, what does the slow cooker approach look like? Here's that same principle said in a different way. Ron Heifetz, again, change expert from Harvard, says when it comes to change, you need to figure out how to fail people's expectations at a rate that they can stand. How do you fail people's expectations at a rate that they can stand? Now, the reason that he mentions that is because he says that if you make changes too fast, people's anxiety will boil over. They won't be able to process it, and then things will not go well for you. If you don't make change fast enough, the change never happens. So when he says you fail people's expectations at a rate that they can stand, it's back to this idea of cooking, that if something is starting to cook a little too fast, you need to turn the temperature down. If something is cooking a little bit too slow, you can turn the temperature up. I would consider, as you're making change, to think about that same principle in your work, that there are times you need to turn the temperature down, slow things down a little bit. There's also times when you do need to speed things up, where you need to turn up the heat a bit. There's one church we worked with who decided to focus, they wanted to focus on young people, but they did not start changing the service to focus on young people immediately. They decided to begin with intergenerational prayer partners. And the reason that they did that is they thought, we need to help different generations connect with each other, particularly an older generation connect with a younger generation, before we ask the older generation to make changes. So they took about 4 to 6 months to invite each adult or senior adult in the church to have a name and be praying for a younger person in the church. What they found was that that experience actually helped increase the focus and empathy towards a younger generation. And when some of those changes started to happen, to changes in worship to focus on younger people and engaging younger people, they found that many of those changes were much better accepted than what they would have been otherwise. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick recap. The first idea that we talked about is that leadership begins with listening. The second one, people support what they help to create. The third one, vision is a shared story of future hope. The fourth one, to experiment on the margins. And then the fifth one, to see change as a process, not just as an event. Now, as you lead, as you begin to make changes, My hope is that some of these tips are going to help you make the changes that you want to make, and hopefully without starting a fight.